the self. But there is no the self. There's just a process, and philosophers call it bundle theory sometimes, a process of perceptions that are bundled together. The self is completely constant and unchanging, this sort of essentialist view of self. Then yes, I think we're mistaken. Panpsychism says that consciousness is sort of fundamental and ubiquitous, a bit like energy or charge. It's a fundamental aspect of things in the universe. Whatever the fundamental constituents of the universe are, consciousness exists at that level. Out-of-body experiences, like you can induce them in the lab. You can change that brain activity in a particular area through stimulation, and you can give people an out-of-body experience, and you stop the stimulation and the out-of-body experience stops. You can even get versions of it with virtual reality and cameras and things. LSD in particular, it had many different aspects to it. One of them is a bit more routine, which is these visual hallucinations that appear. So, I remember seeing clouds turn into animals and people, and things just really morphing into weird and wonderful shapes.
Hi, everyone. Before we start this podcast, I did want to say, 93% of everyone that watches our show aren't subscribed. And it would mean a lot to us if you could hit that subscribe button. So thank you so much and enjoy the podcast.
It's a pleasure to have you on the show, Anil. You've been one of our most awaited guests, so I'm really looking forward to diving into our conversation today.
That's very kind. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. Let's start off with the basics and then build on from there. Can you talk about scientific proofs that differentiate consciousness from mere neural activity? And what evidence do we actually have that consciousness is real and not just a construct of perception?
Well, that's an interesting question to start with. I think the evidence we have is not that they're different things. It's that we're looking for evidence that conscious experiences or aspects of consciousness are in fact lawfully, systematically, and connected to neural processes, things happening in the brain. And there's plenty of evidence of this sort, and it has explanatory power, it has predictive power. I mean, this is why the neuroscience of consciousness is a going concern. There's a lot to do. I think the challenge is this evidence is compatible with many different philosophical ways of thinking about how neural activity and conscious experiences are actually related. Is it that neural activity somehow produces conscious experience, or are they both aspects of some underlying deeper reality that that in our world we seem to see on the one hand physical stuff and on the other hand experiential stuff, or is it the other way around? Is it that consciousness or mental states are primary and what we think of as matter is somehow derivative from consciousness? Empirical evidence doesn't really, at least in my understanding, settle these questions.
Okay. Now, if perception is a controlled hallucination, what does that imply about objective reality itself? And also, according to you, do matter, space, and time actually exist?
Well, for the second part of the question, I think you really need to ask a physicist for that. And there's a lot of debate, as far as I understand. It's ongoing discussions and work, theoretical, empirical. What do we mean by matter, space, and time? I mean, I think it's been clear for a long time, at least since Einstein before that space and time are not, whatever they are, they're not what they naively appear to us to be, 3 dimensions of space and then a separate dimension of time. We also know that matter isn't just sort of very, very small little billiard balls bouncing off each other. I mean, there's much complexity and uncertainty about what matter really is. The whole debate about the foundations of quantum mechanics is, in one way of thinking of that, is a fundamental disagreement about what these things actually mean, or what quantum mechanics implies for how we should think about them. And what's this got to do with consciousness? Well, I think there's an interesting sense in which we put these together, which goes back to one of my sort of favorite philosophers, Immanuel Kant. And one of his central ideas was that objective reality exists. There is a there. Stuff is there. Stuff is happening. Whatever stuff means, whatever happening means. But the way we encounter that in our experience is only ever indirect. We never experience things as they really are. We'll only ever experience an interpretation of them. He called the objective, inaccessible reality the noumenon. And then we experience the phenomenon. It's an indirect interpretation of it. Now, this is kind of clear in some simple examples. So things like colors. It's not controversial that the way we experience color is an interpretation of something that is fundamentally lacking in that property. We just have electromagnetic radiation, which has different wavelengths. And the brain constructs color out of this more fundamental aspect of reality. So the question is, how far does that process of construction, of active interpretation, of controlled hallucination go? Does it go into the way we experience time, the way we experience space, and the way we experience these things that we can take rather for granted as structuring our world?
Yeah, no, beautifully said. And I totally resonate with that because it's true, we assume that everything out there is just happening and we're connected to, but it's very easy, it's very much interpreted, right? And yeah, so that's a very much resonate with that. And because we are talking about consciousness, and I know several people who actually claim that hard problem of consciousness is not actually hard for them at all, right? And I wanted you to elaborate on that, elaborate on the hard problem of consciousness. Does it exist because of our cognitive limitations, or is it truly an unsolvable mystery?
Because I'm probably going to do the same thing again about put a bunch of options and not actually tell you which one is the correct one.
No,
So
no, please,
the
please
hard
feel free, yeah, please
the
feel free
hard
to
problem.
elaborate. Yeah.
Yeah, let's start with what it is. So this is a term from the philosopher David Chalmers, also in New York, I think, like you,
Mm.
and he's been a great influence on the field. He's a philosopher, but very knowledgeable about all the adjacent disciplines as well. And it's really a rephrasing of what has been recognized as a problem for millennia, and it is this problem, as we just said at the beginning, of how to understand the relationship between conscious experience and physical stuff. And Dave Chalmers puts it like this. He says something like, um, it seems objectively unreasonable that physical stuff should give rise to subjective experience, and yet it does. We have these, I think I'm really messing up what he actually said there. But his intuition is that even if we had a complete understanding of the brain in every last detail, there would still be a deep sense of mystery about how and why any of this should be identical to or give rise to a conscious experience. Like, conscious experience doesn't seem to be the kind of thing that we would explain in terms of physical interactions. Descartes said a version of this some hundreds of years ago, and separating the mind from the body, and we see this in different cultural traditions too. So that's the hard problem. It's got a kind of immediate appeal, right? Because we open our eyes and we have, let's say, a visual experience of redness, and there's objects there, and this seems to be like not a property that we can explain in terms of atoms. It's something that seems to be relatively free floating. The redness of red is not a physical property in the obvious sense that other things are. So there's this challenge. How can we even do a science of consciousness when we don't even know what a good answer would look like? And so you get these alternatives. You get some people saying, well, no, we're just confused that the hard problem is a problem. It only seems to be a hard problem because of, as you nicely put it, our cognitive limitations. Or, and maybe these are inescapable. There are some things that human beings may not be able to understand, just as frogs will never understand, economics. We may never understand the nature of consciousness. I think that's a very pessimistic view. I think even though there's plenty of empirical evidence for humans doing a pretty bad job of understanding things, we've also done a pretty good job of making sense of things that seemed mysterious at one point or other in time. And so that's the other option, is that we're not constitutively fenced off from understanding how consciousness happens. We're just not thinking of it in the right way. And I've a bit more sympathy with this view, that part of the problem is the way in which we think about consciousness. If we think about consciousness as one big scary mystery that is in search of one single eureka moment of a solution, then we might be in trouble. Like, not that long ago, people thought that way about life. There was this common view that life could not be explained in terms of physics and chemistry. There had to be this spark of life, this élan vital. So there was one big mystery, and people were looking for this eureka solution of a vital essence. But of course, that didn't turn out to be the way we now understand life. It's not one big scary problem. It's many different things, and each of those things can be explained in different ways. And gradually, the hard problem of life was never solved, but it was gradually dissolved. And for me, that, I think, is the right way to approach the problem of consciousness. I'm agnostic about whether there really is a hard problem or not. I can see the conceptual appeal about it, but I think it's too early to say. I think you have to have a bit of humility about this. We don't know yet. So what's the most productive position to take? And for me, it's to sort of recognize that historical parallel and say, okay, consciousness has many different properties. Can we explain them? Can we provide some explanatory insight, some predictive power? And then maybe the questions will change, and this hard problem of consciousness will gradually dissolve and maybe eventually disappear altogether in some puff of metaphysical smoke.
Very well said, and I'm so glad you also brought up David Chalmers. I believe he also believes in this. But what are your thoughts on panpsychism?
So that's one of the other options, right?
Yeah.
Where matter comes from mind, or mind comes from matter, or they're both aspects of the same thing. Or panpsychism says that consciousness is sort of fundamental and ubiquitous, a bit like energy or charge. It's a fundamental aspect of things in the universe. Whatever the fundamental constituents of the universe are, consciousness exists at that level. That's what the panpsychist view roughly is. I mean, there are varieties of it. I don't find it particularly compelling or useful. Again, it might be right, but I don't think it helps. The only thing I find that it helps you do is basically ignore the hard problem and just say, okay, we don't have to worry about that because consciousness is everywhere. But that's a bit of a easy get out to what is still appears to be a problem. We said earlier as well that a lot of these different metaphysical positions, whether it's panpsychism or materialism, which is broadly that consciousness is a property of matter organized somehow, the evidence we have is largely compatible with both. But the question I have is, what's the most practically useful position to adopt? If you're a materialist, you might do certain kinds of experiments, develop certain kinds of theories, and you may still not solve the hard problem of consciousness, but you'll chip away at it, begin to dissolve it maybe, and find out a whole bunch of other useful things about consciousness in the meantime. If you're a panpsychist, I'm not sure you do that. I'm not sure what other theories or experiments really follow from that. So I can't say it's wrong, but I just don't find it useful.
In the context of consciousness, can you explain, and this is something that, because if for everybody, all the viewers that are watching till this point of the video, this is something more rooted towards them, something that's explained a little bit simply, but can you explain why exactly, we wake up and we feel like the same person every day, despite the fact that our body, brain, and memories are constantly evolving?
This is, I think, is a fascinating question. So this gets at this. So here's one of the things where I think this materialist perspective slightly changes the question, because we might have this intuition that the self is this unchanging essence of personal identity. You are you, and you're the same person every day. And there's something, maybe a soul, perhaps some cultures might call it, that is the essence of you that's there in the head or in the body somewhere. And we have to explain whether this exists. Does the soul exist, or does the self exist? And I think this is the wrong question to ask. And I think a more useful question to ask is, how and why do we have experiences of being a self, of being who you are, of being who I am? And this is, my book is called Being You. It's kind of addressing this question, like what does it mean to have an experience of being a self? And, one answer is, yes, well, there's this essence of you inside your brain, therefore that's why. But another way to think of it is that actually the experience of being a self is just a collection of perceptions. Some of them are of the body, like part of being a self is this object that's my body, the emotions that I feel, sense of agency over my actions. And then there's also a sense of memory and identity and so on. But these are all separable. We know they can come apart in the lab and in the psychiatric or neurological clinic. So this perspective on the self suggests that it's continually something the brain is doing. The brain is always reconstructing this collection of perceptions that is then labeled as the self. But there is no the self. There's just a process, and philosophers call it bundle theory sometimes, a process of perceptions that are bundled together. So we are actually not the same person from one morning to another, or from one year to another, or from 1 minute to another. But we're also not completely different either, right? I mean, yes, this physical constitution of the body changes over time, but there can be some invariance in the processes within the brain and the body, even if the actual cells turn over and become different. So I think there is a continuity to the self, but, and this is the last thing I'll say, is I also think we may overestimate that continuity. Now, there's a phenomenon in perception called change blindness. If you're looking at, I don't know, some picture, and then in the background, the color of the sky, let's say the color of the sky changes slowly from blue to purple. If you're not focusing on it, you won't notice typically the change. So your experience will change, but you don't have the experience of the change. Like, change of experience doesn't mean experience of change. This is called change blindness or inattentional blindness or other things. And I think something like that is happening when it comes to the self, that our experience of being who we are is actually changing, but it's changing over a time scale such that we don't experience ourselves as changing, unless we have some major event or a psychological breakdown or massive dose of psychedelics or some spiritual. There can be many things which can induce that, but by and large, I think we underestimate how much our experience of being who we are is in fact changing from one day to the next, from 1 year to the next.
And if the self is a construct, does that mean that our subjective continuity is an illusion? I would love to get your thoughts on that.
Well, in a sense, we've been dancing around that already. I think yes and no. I mean, if we start from the view that the self is completely constant and unchanging, and this sort of essentialist view of self, then yes, I think we're mistaken. But I think anyone, people who engage in, I know you've had a lot of people on your show who do a lot of meditation and practices like this. Anyone who spends time examining the experience of being a self is going to move away from that essentialist view of the self. And when you pay attention to what the experience of self is like, it isn't constant. It does change. There is an impermanence to it, as is emphasized within Buddhist practice, for instance. And from that perspective, then it becomes much more complicated and interesting. Like, yes, the experience of self is changing. How closely does that experience of a changing self map onto the actual changes that are occurring in the brain and the body and in the perceptual infrastructure for the self. And for that, there's no simple answer. But yeah, I mean, it is a rather amazing thing though, isn't it? If you fall asleep, you wake up, you're the same person. If you have general anesthesia, you're gone completely. But when you come around, you are the same person. Your brain can be completely flatlined in deep states of anesthesia. So this is kind of interesting. And there's all these other thought experiments about, what would happen, for instance, if you were completely duplicated atom for atom and reconstituted, I don't know, in London. So now there's two of you. So what's happening there? Again, it's very difficult for the essentialist view of self to accommodate this, right? If it's this essence, then it must be one of them. But in this process view, you actually have a picture here which makes sense, even if it's a bit weird. So there would actually be two of you. But then, of course, you would start to diverge because you would be having different experiences and becoming different selves little by little.
Wow, very well said. And you brought up frogs before, you brought up animals before, so this is a question that's been on my mind lately, so I'll definitely ask this. Do all animals and insects possess subjective experience similar to ours, or no?
Well, the last part is definitely no. I think there's two questions underneath this: the similarity to us, and then do they possess experience at all? And when we experience the world, part of the difficulty of understanding consciousness is that it seems as though we experience the world exactly as it is. This is bringing us back to Kant again. But it isn't. It's an interpretation. It's a construction. And it's a very species-specific construction, or even an individual construction. And you and I might well experience things a little bit differently, though maybe not massively differently. There's a beautiful German word called the Umwelt from the ecologist, ethologist Jakob von Uexküll. And it's supposed to mean, if you like, the experiential environment of a species. So, humans, we see particular colors, we experience time in a particular way, we see faces, we see objects, we experience ourselves as distinct from others. Now, other animals may inhabit the same objective reality, but experience things in very different ways. Ed Yong wrote a beautiful book called The Immense World. Started with an example about, I think it was an elephant and a mosquito and a mouse and a person all in the same barn or something like that. And he explained how the world, assuming they're having subjective experience, he was sort of describing how different their subjective experiences might be. Mosquitoes are sensitive to carbon dioxide levels. That's how they find people and so on. The mouse would be sensitive to this very, very quiet noises. Really fascinating stuff. Then the second part of the question, what about subjective experience at all? That's much harder to answer. And it's a really key question for, not just for the sake of curiosity, but very practical reasons for animal welfare. If an animal is capable of experiencing things, then it has a sort of moral status that creatures that don't have conscious experiences don't have, or at least it's harder to make the case for them. And here, there's a lot of activity about this at the moment. Because historically, we've done a pretty bad job as human beings in restricting sort of morally significant conscious states to human beings, and in some cases only to some human beings and not to others. So Descartes, who's come up already, he went to great lengths to try and justify that only humans had the sort of rational conscious minds that deserved moral consideration. And he called other animals beast machines, that they didn't really have the stuff that counts. And I think right now there's a move towards greater recognition that consciousness shouldn't be defined in terms of the human example. So instead of bundling consciousness with human-specific things like intelligence or language, at least we like to think intelligence is human-specific, but it isn't. Rich language maybe is arguably more human specific. We should think about consciousness more fundamentally as the capacity for any kind of experience whatsoever. But then the question is, how do you know which organisms have it and which don't, if they lack, say, the language to tell you? This is a difficult challenge, and I think you do it bit by bit. You generalize out from where you're sure, you try to understand what the mechanisms are, and then you see, are there signs of those elsewhere? For me, I start to get pretty uncertain when we talk about insects and some fish.
Okay. Hmm. You know, you were also, first of all, very well put. But you brought up two things, right? You brought up the dream state. You brought up the state of when we're under anesthesia. I wanted to first talk about dreams and the science of dreams. Now, why do dreams feel so real while they happen, yet nonsensical in hindsight? And could you also provide some clarity on the role of consciousness during deep sleep and what your thoughts on lucid dreaming are?
I mean, dreams are just endlessly fascinating, and it's the one part of Freud's work that I keep thinking is really worth returning to. His work on dreams. It's just people have wondered what they're for, tried to find meaning in them, significance in them for a long time. But to your question, yeah, one of the remarkable things is crazy stuff can happen and it doesn't seem crazy at the time, right? In dreams. Why is that? Well, part of I guess the simple part of the explanation is that, well, if you look inside the brains of people who are dreaming, you'll find typically that the areas that are generally involved in perceptual experience are very, very active. But areas of the brain that are more involved in rationality and reflecting on mental states, what in the business we call metacognition, thoughts about thoughts, cognition about cognition. Those areas, to put it very crudely, are shut off. They're not as active as they are normally. So subjectively, that sort of makes sense, that we then have a lack of insight into what's happening in our dream state. But there's a whole load of deeper things here, which I think the jury's still very much out on. Like, why would dreams be like that? Why is evolution, if assuming evolution had something to do with it, tuned our brains so that A, firstly they dream, and then B, the dreams have this character that they do. I think one of the easiest questions to answer is why we forget our dreams, and we do. Most people do. I try to keep a dream diary, but I'm not very good at it. And I think this is quite easy to explain. If we remembered our dreams easily, we'd be much more likely to confuse dreams with real memories, and that could be very, very maladaptive for us if we started to think that something actually happened when it just happened in a dream. And this does happen from time to time with people, as it is, but it would be problematic if it happened much more of the time.
And could you compare that to the state of while you're under anesthesia? Because I watched your TEDx where you were talking about that you were undergoing a surgery, I believe, where you had to anesthesia. If you could shed a little bit of light on that.
Yeah, so I mean, for me, the fascinating thing about anesthesia is how different it is from any of the sleep states, whether it's dreaming or just deep sleep where you're not dreaming so much. When you've been asleep for a while and you wake up, even if the sleep has been very deep and relatively free of dreams, you still know roughly how much time has passed, whether it's 2 hours or 10 hours or 10 minutes. But under anesthesia, it's completely different. You are not there. You are gone, and then you are back. And I don't know, have you ever had general anesthesia?
No, never, no.
Well, I'm sure. Well, maybe it will. Maybe.
Maybe.
If you need it, then I'm sorry for the reasons why. But at least the benefit, the silver lining, will be it's a very interesting philosophical experience or non-experience to go through. You're turned into an object and then back again into a person. So in deep enough general anesthesia, there is no consciousness at all. The confusion happens, I think, because in the periphery of anesthesia, especially when you're coming round in the recovery room, that can be a very dreamlike state. Semi-hallucinating, some semi-dreaming. And so sometimes people remember those experiences, although often people forget them too. Sometimes people remember them and sort of retrospectively project them back into the period of general anesthesia itself. But I think that's almost certainly an illusion that actually no, that during anesthesia there's no experience if it's deep enough, but there can be unusual experiences on the fringes.
Wow. Because we are talking about anesthesia, and although haven't had an experience of being in that state, I wanted to talk to you about near-death experiences. This is something that I experienced myself, but I don't want to go deep into my experience. But because I am a skeptic myself, I always look at scientific reasons behind everything. And, in regards to NDEs, particularly the commonly reported sensation of moving towards a light, feelings of ecstasy, are these experiences purely the result of brain activity during trauma, or could they suggest something deeper about consciousness?
Well, what would that deeper thing be?
Deeper that there's something after death, maybe.
Hmm.
I'm not sure. I don't know, but something that consciousness is not, it survives beyond death, and it's more of a vast thing than we know.
Mm. I mean, is that what you took from your? I'm interested in, and so you said you had one of these
I'll
experiences.
I'll see. That's the thing. I'm still figuring
Mm.
my experience out, but I'll share a little bit. Now, I'm actually an actor and musician. I was working on a project, and I was auditioning for this. I got my script, and I overexerted myself during the audition. It was for a musical to the point that I completely just couldn't stop breathing. They call later on. They told me it was an asthma attack, but I've never had asthma before. But basically, I felt my lungs kind of squeeze up, and I just couldn't take breath. Now, me being a 20-something-year-old, I was in denial. I was like, "Oh no, nothing is gonna happen. I'll be totally fine." But when the point came that my face was turning purple, my friend said, and he got scared, and I just ran towards the front door of my house, opened the window to get some air, and I just completely passed out. My friend ended up calling the ambulance, and I don't remember anything that happened at that point. It was probably like an hour, maybe they told me, that passed by. But the doctor, when I woke up in the hospital, he told me that if it was even a second or more, I would have not been able to, uh, I would have been dead. And now my experience specifically was very unique because I was trying to understand it from a very, very not a spiritual perspective towards that point. And I was like, even though I was in so much pain, why did I feel such a release and feeling of ecstasy when I passed out? That was one. And second, all my memories came back to me, you know, like this, like something that humanly I could never experience while I'm in a normal state in everyday life. And
Mm.
and then yeah, I saw a light. Now, because me being a skeptic, I would love to get your point of view
Mm.
on what you think NDEs could be.
Well, I mean, I'm sorry to hear that happened to you, and I'm very
Yeah.
glad that it turned out okay. And I know may well be for you, but for a lot of people who've had NDEs, it's one of the more significant experiences in their lives and carries a lot of meaning. So I'm always want to be a little bit careful here because I think the approach we would have to something like an NDE is to take people's reports of their experiences very, very seriously because they're very meaningful. But that doesn't always mean taking them literally as signifying what they seem to signify. Before, just as a very quick context for that, there's another experience which I think is illuminating in this situation, which is out of body experiences. Sometimes these are parts of NDEs as well. Sometimes people feel they've left their body, can see their body from above, or they feel that they're not in their body, something like that. Now, again, these can be very, very powerful experiences for people. Um, and there's no reason to doubt that they have the experiences they say they have. So we should take them very seriously. But to take it literally would be to say, okay, so it seems as though you've left your body, so that means your consciousness is not in fact tied to your body and it can be separated and move around. That's a very hard explanation to actually sustain. And it's also not really compatible with other sources of evidence about out-of-body experiences. Like, you can induce them in the lab. You can change brain activity in a particular area through stimulation, and you can give people an out-of-body experience, and you stop the stimulation, and the out-of-body experience stops. You can even get versions of it with virtual reality and cameras and things. So I think the way to explain those is like, well, actually, it's not that your consciousness can leave your body and go floating around. It's more interesting than that. It's that the experience of having a first-person perspective that is normally co-located with your body, you shouldn't take that for granted. I mean, that's something the brain is continually figuring out. Like, where should the first-person perspective be? And sometimes it goes wrong in out-of-body experiences, and maybe for good reasons. There's sort of maybe dissociation is helpful in trauma and so on. But for me, that's a far more interesting explanation, because it's really getting at an aspect of our experience that we would otherwise take for granted. That, like, well, of course I see the world from somewhere behind my eyes. I mean, what else? Where else would it be from? And now we have good understanding. No, actually, the brain is doing something really, really cool here in constructing the first-person perspective. So from that bit of context, if you think about NDEs in the same way, I think, again, the idea of taking it seriously but not literally is at least it's what I find myself most comfortable with. So yes, aspects like the light, I think, are quite readily explained in terms of what would happen if you basically turned off the supply of oxygenated blood to the visual cortex. You might well see something like this. The memories, so on, that's a bit harder. I mean, obviously, a problem with NDEs is you can't induce them experimentally in the lab. You're not going to get ethical permission to do that. So we have a lot of anecdotal reports that they have a lot of common features. And again, those can be interpreted in two ways. You can say, well, how come these people's experiences are so similar? Unless they're pointed to some deeper reality about life after death or something. But of course, we all have reasonably similar brains too. So the similarity could have a very, very, in a sense, mundane reason that actually at the level of our physiology, one NDE is much the same as another.
No, I'm glad you explained it that way, because that's even, I'm here constantly thinking about my experience and trying to understand that, yeah, if, for example, that light that I saw, maybe it was a hallucination. Maybe something in your chemicals in your brain happens at the point of death where that can trigger these feelings of the light, these feelings of ecstasy. But yeah, thank you so much for explaining it that way.
And there is some work with non-human animals, actually. It's slightly macabre, I must admit, but it exists because with animals you can, a lot of, let's say, rats that get involved in experiments, at the end of the day they're euthanized, and so it is possible to record from the brain, as these animals die. One of the findings you see there is you can't really tell whether their whole rodent life is flashing before their eyes, but that's the problem with the, you don't know what they're experiencing. But what you can see is, in many cases, the brain activity goes really kind of haywire around the moment of death. There's a lot of stuff going on that you don't normally see, and so it's not a leap to imagine, well, if that's also the case in human beings, there's going to be some very distinctive experiential reflection of that.
Because we are talking about death, and this is something I'm very much interested in myself, I wanted to talk about cryonics, just because, there have been a lot of videos I've seen on social media. And the one thing that when I'm doing a podcast, I love to talk about things that possibly could be misinformation, just because, if we are doing these podcasts, the one thing I like is the audience to kind of get information that is most true to because easily can be misinformed. But I've seen a lot of videos that a lot of labs that are actually people are freezing their bodies in the hopes that in the future they could unfreeze it to cure cancer or disease that they have that at this point there's no solution to. Is is cryonics possible according to you?
It's not. I'm not an expert in it, so but I do know a bit about it.
Yeah,
Um,
please.
you know, I'm not tempted, and I think the issue is that philosophically, yes, it's sort of if you are able to preserve the brain exactly, molecule for molecule as it is, you know, hold it in some stasis and then restart it in some way. I don't see any philosophical obstacle for why, consciousness couldn't be sort of turned back on later on. The issue is, um, in practice, even extrapolating the kinds of technologies that we have, this seems an incredibly difficult thing to do, right? Brains are, they're not simple machines. They're not even complex machines. They're whole different kinds of things. Once you stop the ongoing process of metabolism and so on, uh, fine-grained aspects of brain structure and physiology will change. I don't think it's not just like putting your car away for the winter or something, then filling the oil back in, turning it on. Um, I think much, much harder than that. Not totally impossible, but and a lot of interesting things happening. So there are people experimenting with injecting different kinds of chemicals that do a better job of preserving, antifreezes, and then you freeze it. All kinds of things you can do. Because one of the big challenges when you freeze something, you get all these ice crystals forming, and ice crystals very damaging to biological tissue. So you have to replace the blood with some kind of weird antifreeze blood equivalent so that you don't get all this problem. But yeah, I find it very, very unlikely that it will be successful. And also back to this idea of what is the self. So if you turn the brain back on, but the body isn't there, what's that going to be like? Yourself, part of the experience of being you is the brain's interaction with the specific body that you have. Uh, and anyway, who wants to well, okay, if you want a cure for a disease that you have, that might be one thing. But if you just want to live forever, that's another thing entirely. And I just worry about, the kind of societal attitudes and norms that we have.
No, no, I totally agree with you because there's a whole like ethical side of that too, you know. I mean,
Mm.
even if like why it's like I'll say it in the simplest way possible, and people watching would totally understand this. I think it was Vampire Diaries, this vampire show, and one of the vampires who's immortal literally says that because of immortality, he literally wants to find a way to die because he is so bored of his life. If we are currently having problems of finding meaning in our life in the time that we have and we think extending that is going to make us more happy. That's a whole philosophical thing, but that's a struggle on its own, right? And because I brought that up, I did want to go a little bit on a philosophical track, but connect that with neuroscience. I would love to explore the debate between free will and determinism from a neuroscientific perspective. According to you, what extent do we actually exercise free will, given the growing evidence that, our decisions are shaped by unconscious neural processes? And
Mhm.
additionally, how does neuroplasticity, our brain's ability to rewire itself in response to experience, factor into this discussion? Does it suggest that we have some capacity for self-directed change, or is even the process ultimately governed by deterministic mechanisms?
I mean, there's a lot to unpack here. I think the question of free will, it's actually a very good example of how I think the questions are beginning to change. So, the progress isn't just answering the question that you set out with. It's a bit like the hard problem of consciousness itself. Maybe the question changes. By free will, what a lot of people, or what some people seem to want to to possess when they say they have free will is this sort of a conscious capacity for being an uncaused cause of things, so that our conscious self can make stuff happen that wouldn't otherwise happen. That's one idea of it's kind of a libertarian idea of free will, that free will can actually, mess around with the causal flow of events in the world. And of course, that is not compatible with determinism. Determinism being, that the world just sort of unfolds along the lines, wherever it's going, the Schrödinger equation continues to evolve, whatever. If that's true, then this libertarian free will can't be true. So my problem with that is, like, that's the wrong kind of free will. That's not the kind of free will we should even be wanting, because it sort of has all this other baggage about consciousness being separate from, somehow dualistic, separate from matter, but able to interact with it. The self and the soul as being these sorts of, causally efficacious essences. I think there's just a lot of confusion there. So, but I do think that there is a version of free will that is sensible, that we have, and that is totally compatible with determinism. Doesn't mean that I don't know, and frankly don't much care whether determinism is true or not. I don't think it's that relevant, because even if there is some randomness, that doesn't give you free will. That's just randomness. We don't want the ability to be random. What do we want by free will? We're organisms. What I think a sensible conception of free will is the ability of a complex organism to engage in voluntary actions. And if you think about what the experience of free will is like, there are usually three aspects to it. We have the feeling that an action that we do is coming from within rather than being externally imposed. We have the feeling that it's aligned with what we want to do. If I want to make a cup of tea, then I make a cup of tea. And we have the feeling that perhaps we could have done otherwise. Well, I could have made coffee instead of tea. Those are the three things that give free will its kind of phenomenological character. And they're all perfectly, I think, explainable. So I think the experience of free will is the brain perceiving what the most likely cause of an action was. And we're complicated organisms. Some of the actions we do are more internal than others. They're not just a reflex action. Somebody kicks me in the shin and and I react. Some of them have causes that extend more deeply within my body before they extrude out into the environment. And when the brain infers that the causes are more within, then we experience it as freely willed. Does it mean we could have done otherwise? I don't think so. I think we can only do what we do, but that's fine. That's also compatible with the experience of free will. It's not that I want to do something and I do something else. No, I only do what the thing is at one time anyway, whatever that thing is. But, and this is the last part of your point, there is this aspect of neuroplasticity too. So I think one of the reasons evolution has sort of built in this experience of free will is so that it can pay attention to the result of an action like that, and then maybe the brain changes or is more open to change, so that the system might do something else the next time. So we experience this feeling of could have done otherwise, not because we actually could have, but because we might do something different the next time, because, just connecting the dots with the previous part, we'll be a slightly different person then. So we would now be the person that instead of doing X does Y. And so for me, it makes sense. And I think of free will a little bit like the color red. Red, we have an experience of red. That's a real experience, but there is no real redness out there in the world. It's a construction of the brain, but it's a useful construction. I think the same goes for free will. It's not picking out the thing that is free will, but it's a useful way for the brain to represent in our conscious experience something else, which is the causal origin of an action that we make.
Wow, Anil, that was such thank you for that unique perspective. I'm really sure our audiences are going to be able to think a lot about this. And just because we ask a lot of our guests about free will, and just getting your unique perspective on it, it's going to be really helpful to open up a conversation in the comments. I'm really excited about that. Um, to close this conversation, I know you were talking about LSDs before,
Hmm.
and I want to know from you, because you've had this experience, what happens to consciousness during the consumption of psychedelics? I would love for you to talk about your LSD trip and what people mean when they describe they experienced an altered state of consciousness.
Yeah, it's back to this seriously but not literally thing. I think it's super interesting, right? Um, it's a remarkable thing, really. You can take a small amount of this chemical, LSD, but other ones too, psilocybin, DMT. There are various psychedelics, um, and your experience changes dramatically. And for me, this is like it's a extraordinary demonstration of the power of a materialist perspective on consciousness. You change the brain in this way, and you change consciousness in a specific way too. And what do we learn from? So again, there's two ways of interpreting it. You could say, okay, like on psychedelics, I experience a oneness with the universe and complete dissolution of my sense of self and all of these things. All of these things can happen in a psychedelic experience. That's true. Does that mean that in fact consciousness is separate from the brain and again can go floating around, and that indeed you are one with the universe and we're all the same person and whatever it might feel like? No, it doesn't mean that. But what it means is that's a possible region in the space of, well, that's a region in the space of possible human experiences. And I think so. The psychedelic experience for me is evidence for what is the space of possible experiences like, and it can refract back on things we might otherwise take for granted. So, for instance, in some psychedelic experiences, time and space lose their definition too. Right back to where we started. Time may not seem to flow. Space may not seem to have any three-dimensionality to it anymore. This is super interesting because it again tells us, okay, our normal experience of time and space should not be taken for granted. It's something actually that the brain is doing. And when you kick the brain into a different state, these experiences change in a ways they would never do in normal life. In my experience of LSD in particular, it had many different aspects to it. One of them is a bit more routine, which is these visual hallucinations that appear. So, I remember seeing clouds turn into animals and people and things just really morphing into weird and wonderful shapes all around. There's a lot of other emotional and self, but and I thinking about that after the fact, it's very hard to reflect on these things sensibly during the trip, but thinking about it after the fact kind of makes perfect sense in the way in which I think about how the brain perceives the world normally, that it's continually making predictions about sensory data and using sensory data to update those predictions. And if you mess around with that balance, then you'll start hallucinating in these ways that people report and that I experienced in LSD. So I rather think of LSD in the first instance, or psychedelics in general, as wonderful opportunities to really explore what we take for granted and experience normally, and how indeed brain activity relates to experience, because you change the brain and your experience changes. And then secondary to that, there's a lot of excitement, as I'm sure you know, about the potential therapeutic benefits of LSD and other psychedelics for mental health, depression, anxiety, PTSD, and so on. And I think I'm optimistic about this movement, though I think there's also sometimes a bit too much hype around it too. I think we have to be very careful because nothing, let alone a psychedelic, is a sort of panacea. You don't take a psychedelic and that's it. The efficacy of something like that is in the space it opens, the potential it gives you for change. It doesn't give you the change in and of itself. So it's all about, I think, effective combinations of psychedelics with psychotherapy in the right set and setting, in the right context. That's if we get that right, then I think we may well be onto something.
Very well explained. I really like the fact that it does give you a sense of you know what you're taking for granted and whatnot, and more than that, because it is very easy to, I guess, see all these hallucinations and whatnot, and kind of try to go on like a totally different track and find such deep meaning to it, and sometimes you can get lost in that. So I'm glad that you explained it that way. Lastly, Anil, for people who haven't read your most recent book yet, what do you hope readers can take away from your book, Being You?
So I think what people are not going to get this eureka solution to the hard problem of consciousness. I'm not sort of offering that, but I think that would be the wrong thing to offer anyway from anyone. What I hope people take from it is a deeper understanding of who they are, of what it means to be a human being, not necessarily the specific human being that they are, and a kind of appreciation that conscious experience is this everyday miracle, that we should really reflect on how amazing it is that we are able to experience anything. It could be that, we talk about whether there's life on other planets. And probably there is, but who knows whether it's intelligent. And then people talk about, is it just grey goo or is it intelligent life? But the real question for me is there any conscious life anywhere else? Because if there isn't conscious life anywhere else, it doesn't really mean very much. Consciousness is what gives our lives meaning, makes them worth living, and sometimes makes them worth leaving. We don't want to live forever, most of us. And so I think people reading the book can, I don't know, have a greater recognition and appreciation for the wonderful things that each of us really are. And just to bring it up to date, how different we are from things like language models and AI and all this stuff. We're tempted these days, I think, to project ourselves far too easily into these technological chimeras and creations. I think we need to remember and recall and focus on what makes us different from the machines that we build. That's what makes us special. And that's what can give us a deeper sense of meaning and a lens through which we can make sense of our own lives. I think actually the book, I know it's from just what I hear, it's been very helpful to people in understanding their own lived experience. And that's something that I feel, I'm very, very happy to hear, frankly.